without any further ado, it is my real pleasure to welcome Maureen Cassidy-Geiger, our speaker this evening. Maureen is best known to this audience as a Meissen specialist, though her interests and publications extend far beyond this. She is an internationally recognized curator and scholar with special expertise in European decorative arts, court culture, and the histories and patterns of collecting and display. Mentored by Claire Le Corbeillier at the Met Museum in New York, Maureen has since worked as a guest curator and consultant for a range of museums across Europe and across the US. We're delighted to welcome Maureen here this evening to give us a talk about the grandest of tours, fragile diplomacy meets the Grand Tour. We're delighted to have her here. We've got over 265 of you joining us. So welcome everyone, and Maureen, over to you. Thank you so much.
I'm not seeing the screen, so what do I have to do? Reduce you. There we are. Is that right? Okay.
Right, and then you just share screen.
Oh, have I lost you?
Yes. If you go back into the Zoom at the bottom, you've got your little green arrow button at the bottom that says share screen.
Oh, I'm awfully sorry. We had it all worked out earlier.
No,
and
please don't apologize.
Share
We're
screen.
here learning.
Okay. Is that right?
Perfect. There we go. Fantastic.
Okay. Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Greetings from New York, where it's just after 2 p.m. in the afternoon, and we are finally in phase 1 of reopening. It was the pandemic that introduced me to Zoom, and I applaud the French Porcelain Society for initiating the living room lectures, which have offered so many of us community and connection during this truly bewildering time. That said, we were all so weary of the screen and overwhelmed by the virtual offerings which compete for our time and attention. So I thank you for joining me in my living room on a Saturday morning, afternoon, or evening, wherever you might be. Lockdown hit New York as I was preparing to spend a week at the American Academy in Rome to further some writing about the teenager on the screen, Crown Prince Friedrich Christian of Saxony, who, as many of you know, has taken me on the grandest of tours for almost 20 years as I researched his travel diaries that document a 2-year odyssey abroad in 1738 to 40. This involved in situ research in the cities he visited, as well as driving the 2,500-mile itinerary start to finish twice, once in a Volkswagen and once in a Bentley. I discovered the Prince while preparing the 2007 Bard Graduate Center exhibition, Fragile Diplomacy, which probably some of you caught. You see the entrance to the show on the screen. The subject of the exhibition was the diplomatic gifts of Meissen porcelain that were presented to the courts of Europe and other worthies by the legendary Augustus the Strong, Elector of Saxony and King of Poland and founder of the Meissen Porcelain Manufactory, and by his equally famous son and successor, King August III, my prince's father. The prince's travel diaries have survived in the Dresden State Archives and extend to thousands of pages of reporting on his daily activities, such that it is possible to precisely reconstruct his daily experiences over 2 years via multiple eyewitness accounts. The diaries contain ample evidence of Meissen porcelain gifts to the prince's hosts, as well as the diplomatic gifts provided in return. So we'll be speaking about much more than porcelain. Here is a view of the galleries of the Meissen gifts to Italy and Austria, which will feature in the talk today, including one of the vases presented to the prince's hosts in Venice, the Mocenigo family, whose coats of arms hover on the surface of this elaborately decorated showpiece. My infatuation with the prince did not end with Fragile Diplomacy when it closed in 2008. As happens to many of us, we become attached to the subject of our research, and gradually the prince became my prince. In fact, people encounter me and they say, "How's the prince?" knowing that he's my subject and muse. As a scholar and mother, I was touched by his remarkable story. It really had a maternal connection to him. And I was touched by his unfulfilled destiny. That is, he succeeded his father as Elector of Saxony for only 2 months before dying of smallpox, without time to win the crown of Poland or garner a place of history. Thus, he's been largely overlooked and forgotten despite voluminous archival documentation as befitted the heir to the throne. So I mounted another exhibition in Dresden in 2018 entitled The Grande Kur. This brought the prince's tour of Italy to broader awareness, and consequently he emerged from the shadows and his life became more visible and interesting to curators and scholars. Since then, a symposium to examine his life was actually funded and scheduled for the end of this month, but due to COVID, it's been postponed to next year. The concept was to publish the papers in 2022 on the anniversary of his birth. As suggested by the exhibition title, the prince was disabled, and this disability meant that he lived a fairly sheltered life and was largely invisible to the public and to historians until the present day. However, he was the number 2 or number 3 son, depending on how you count it, and essentially the spare heir with 3 younger sisters. So when his 2 older brothers died, at least one of them from smallpox, that era's invisible scourge, he became crown prince and had to be groomed for the position. This is the reason he journeyed to Italy, not merely on a grand tour, which was the kind of educational gap year undertaken by young aristocrats and milords from the 17th century onwards, but he was chiefly destined for a cure, for medical treatment in the celebrated mineral springs on Ischia in the Bay of Naples. The Grande Kur exhibition, here you see the central gallery, featured objects in the Dresden collections that were gifts to the prince, as well as souvenirs and commissioned works of art. The portraits of the prince that you see in the gallery on the right by Rosalba and on the left by Subreas were executed in person in Venice and Rome, and the Roman portrait was paid for by the prince himself. The rather X-rated boxer or gladiator in the foreground was presented to the prince by the Cardinals Albani on behalf of the Pope and was a gift to King August III. The case on the right in the foreground displays some of the early 18th century restorations to the headless ancient sculpture, which turned an ancient Roman athlete or god into a gladiator or boxer. I just wanted to mention this exhibition was really groundbreaking because we dealt with issues of disability, and there was special programming and wall panels that were written actually for non-specialists and for disabled visitors to the exhibition. So it was a wonderful opportunity to present the prince in many guises and to introduce a far broader audience, make this kind of very erudite subject much more accessible. So I'm very proud of the exhibition and what we were able to achieve. Other gifts that he brought home from Italy included mosaic portraits of Christ and the Virgin Mary from the Vatican workshops, a map of Venice dedicated to the prince. You see his coat of arms here on the lower left. Ceramics from the Castelli workshop, the golden rose or rose d'or, as was presented by the Pope to princesses and queens. This one still survives in Krakow today in the treasury. He was given both Pietra d'Oro tables in Venice from the Opificio by the Medici, but also this table inset with mosaic panels from Hadrian's Villa, a gift from the Albani. Also on the lower right, you see a relic of St. Peter presented to him as well in Rome that survives in the cathedral in Bautzen. You see that the categories of gifts were both local in character, that is, emphasizing the products of various regions, but they were also devotional objects as suited an heir to a Catholic throne. Antiquities, of course, were common collector's items for grand tourists, and the popes, the church, controlled a lot of the conditions for the export of these works of art. The panel from Hadrian's Villa, the mosaic panel inset into this tabletop, is actually the largest known mosaic work from Hadrian's Villa to exist to the present day. We were extremely fortunate to have been able to exhibit a range of rarely seen archival documentation from the State Archives in Dresden, and it included one volume of the prince's travel diaries. There are 3 volumes altogether that he personally wrote in French, which was the court language of the day. Despite the bombing in 1945, the documentation for the prince's life has survived almost intact, and the Dresden State Archives are among the best preserved in Europe. His documentation includes his complete medical history from birth until his death at the age of 41. The Italian-born Count Wackerbat Salmor was the head of the prince's household for most of his life, and consequently a kind of surrogate father. He was responsible for writing daily accounts of the prince's activities, which were addressed to the king and couriered on a regular weekly or twice weekly basis to Dresden or Warsaw or wherever the king and the queen might be. The official journals are bound together with letters from Wackerbat and the king's legendary prime minister, Heinrich Count Brühl. First, there were drafts written, and these drafts of these letters survive, also written in French. Once the drafts were approved and corrected, they were rewritten by a trained multilingual secretary in beautiful script, as you see here. And then Wackerbat provided his signature here at the bottom. Copies of outbound letters were kept, and inbound replies were bound with them. Consequently, we have complete back and forth for all correspondence exchanged between Dresden or Warsaw and the prince's locations abroad. And you see here, for example, there's a number, so they could match up the inbound and outbound, and they numbered the correspondence in this way. Letter writing was an art form at the time, as you can imagine. The prince wrote letters to members of his family and received them in turn. And there were loads of letters between the prince's confessor, other members of his entourage, people in Dresden, distant family members. And that's something that I think was essential for keeping in touch, since people didn't meet on a regular basis. And certainly we can relate to that as we rely on texting, emails, and Zoom to be in touch with our community, family, and friends today. On the left, you see a page from the German language diary that was kept by the prince's brother, Hans Moritz von Brühl. He was a budding diplomat who traveled with the prince's entourage and kept his own diary during the year that the prince spent in Rome. And on the right is a shipping document in Italian, listing the items to be shipped from Rome to Dresden via Hamburg. You see it's in Italian, and it underscores the need for multilingual secretaries and staff, since the court language of French was chiefly spoken by the educated members of his entourage and not by the everyday citizens they encountered and employed abroad. We also exhibited a volume of the prince's privy purse, which recorded his private expenditures. By and large, the sums are small, and they reflect the purchase of relics and music, alms for the poor, donations to religious orders, tips to couriers, and lots of gambling losses. The prince gamed almost every evening with ladies of the court or the clerics, and evidently he lost more than he won. Occasionally, there are large payments, like this one of 220 scudi to the artist Subleyes for this portrait you see on the screen, and 2 copies, one for the king, one for Count Wackerbat, and one for Count Brühl. The painting in the upper right by Subleyes, by the artist Subleyes, was presented to the prince as a gift in the hopes, perhaps, of being summoned to work as a court artist in Dresden. The actual logistical and day-to-day costs of the 2-year journey were covered by the crown. So again, this is the prince's private expenditures, the cash on hand that he was entitled to when he came of age, and he could use it at his discretion. Remarkably, we have his entire run of privy purses from a young age until the end of his life, and they are fascinating documents for the kinds of expenditures that happened at the Leipzig Fair, the elite markets, but also during the 7 Years' War, for example, when there were certainly limitations in terms of what was accessible to buy. In the 10 years between Fragile Diplomacy and the Grande Kur, my research shifted from Meissen Porcelain to the Prince himself. With grant money and fellowships as time and opportunities allowed, I researched his life before the Grande Kur and dug deeper into the travel diaries and other archival documentation. This involved periods of research in Dresden, Rome, Naples, Venice, and Vienna, not complaining. There were also residencies at the Getty in Los Angeles, at the Dora Maar House in Minerve, and at the Herzog Anton Bibliothek in Wolfenbüttel. And I drove his itinerary twice, as already mentioned, to witness his route firsthand with the diaries in the passenger's seat. Remarkably, I couldn't get anyone to drive the route with me, not in a Volkswagen in 2010, nor in a Bentley in 2012, notwithstanding I did ask. And I must thank, and so consequently, I think you can see why I titled this lecture The Grandest of Tours, because the Prince has consistently taken me places I might not have traveled before. The Prince is always with me when I travel, and I must thank as well an ever-widening circle of generous colleagues in museums and academia, my family, friends, and even innocent bystanders who are touched by the Prince and his story and have supported me in ways large and small. Given our inability to travel safely or easily right now, I hope the images from my road trips and fellowships will transport you to a time before COVID clipped our wings. As you see by the map and these various diagrams, on May 12, 1738, the 15-year-old prince and his entourage departed Dresden for Naples, traveling overland in a dozen carriages of the types you see on the screen called Berliners and Landaus. This carriage in particular is in the fabulous Coach Museum in Lisbon, where I should be at the Gulbenkian for a fellowship in July, also postponed. The Prince traveled incognito as Comte de Lusace to avoid the trappings of state visits, altogether bypassing Vienna, Venice, and Rome on the southward journey to save time and money. Nevertheless, the trip to Naples took a month. His entourage of 42 persons, as you see them listed here, included his major domo, Count Wackerbot, secretaries, a priest who acted as his tutor, his personal physician, accountant, valets, pages, a hairdresser, couriers, a chef, and 27 servants. Some staff were sent ahead to check the conditions of the route, literally of the roads. Often they were washed out in the rains. To organize security, make sure the route was safe, and that guards from their next stop, city guards would be on hand to secure his stop or lodgings along the way. They didn't send a military force with him, so state carriages and security were borrowed from point to point to point by their hosts and local governments. Staff were also sent ahead to ready the meals and the overnight accommodations. The accommodations might be a borrowed palace or a wayside inn, and the entourage generally traveled from sunup to sundown. We have indications that the prince routinely was up at 4 in the morning and on the road by 5. The post road from Dresden took them through present-day Czechoslovakia, or the Czech Republic, formerly Czechoslovakia, via Prague, into Austria and Slovenia to the fortress city of Palmanova. Notice by the blue line indicating the southward journey that they detoured from the main post roads in order to visit the Marian pilgrimage churches around Mariazell. On the northward journey indicated by the red line, the prince took the more conventional route and stopped for 2 months at his mother's court capital, Vienna. And here you see an admirer of the car outside of the Ratkani at the top of castle complex in Prague, with the Lobkowitz Palace right here, which is where he stayed, northbound and southbound and northbound. The actual impetus for the marriage of for the journey was the marriage of the prince's 13-year-old sister Maria Amalia. He was 15, she was 13. She was married by proxy to the King of Naples in May 1738. As the wedding was being negotiated, the prince's parents were writing to foreign capitals for medical advice on treatments for their disabled son, and they wrote to the medical establishment in Naples, which was famous in the day for holistic treatments involving mineral baths and massage therapy. So it was hastily decided to send my prince to Naples with his sister, who was married by proxy. So therefore, she was not meeting her husband until she arrived in his kingdom of Naples, that would become her adopted kingdom. This was in a breach of protocol to send the prince with the queen. She was cognito and queen of Naples, and he was incognito, a count and not a prince. Technically a prince, but incognito, he was a count. Nevertheless, there was a shortage of equipment, of horses, and they had to be sent together. There was no other choice. As you can imagine, the queen's entourage was far more numerous than the prince's. Although the objective was medical treatment, religious indoctrination was also of equal importance. The Habsburg women, Maria Josepha, consort of August III, practiced a mystical brand of Catholicism, which they ingrained in the prince, and it involved the worship of relics and veneration of the saints. Hence, the healing power of prayer was considered to be equal to that of medicine, making Italy a prime destination, even though medicine was what was advocated by the king. After a ceremonial arrival on Venetian soil at Palmanova, the travelers all but bypassed the city of Venice to avoid the delays of the state reception and were welcomed into papal territory at Ferrara by the Pope's envoys. And this is significant because it means, although they briefly traveled through the Venetian Republic, most of the journey took place in papal lands and not in other states. So they remained within the papal territories until crossing into the Kingdom of Naples at Gaeta. Wherever they stopped, state coaches were sent to transport the queen and her brother into the major cities. In other words, Ferrara and some of the smaller cities that they encountered on the way. The blue southward route took them to Loreto before crossing the peninsula for Naples, underscoring the fact that the journey was a carefully scripted Marian pilgrimage to the shrine of the Santa Casa. The prince's rather impromptu return journey is given in white, demonstrating a year-long stay in Rome and 6 months in Venice after an initial 5 months in Naples for a cure and recuperation. My prince was the legitimate heir to the electoral throne of Saxony. His father and grandfather were both elected kings of Poland, having converted to Catholicism in order to be eligible. As heads of the states of Saxony and Poland, they ruled a land mass comparable in size to that of the other leading courts of Europe, other leading Catholic courts of Europe, Austria, Spain, and France. These two kings of Poland also enjoyed the protection of Russia and were regularly threatened by their neighbor, Prussia. It was hoped that the Polish crown would become the hereditary right of the Saxon electors, so it was imagined that my prince would be the next king of Poland. After he succumbed to smallpox that had taken his older brother and died in 1763, 2 months after his father, he was an elector, but not a king, and that's why he became a footnote in history books instead of a standout like his father and grandfather. This painting represents a family reunion in 1737 within present-day Czech Republic, and I show it to you to make a few points. First of all, you will note the court clothing, the state carriage on the left, and the crowd of royalty and courtiers who were gathered as Queen Maria Josepha greets her mother, Dowager Empress Wilhelmine Amalie of Austria. So Maria Josepha is the consort of King August III. It gives you an impression of the opulence and formality of the court occasions that the young Queen Maria Amalia was strategically avoiding on her journey from Dresden to Naples, where she would meet her husband. I hasten to add it was a fairly unique situation for a royal bride to ever be reunited with her parents, as most brides traveled to distant courts and never saw their parents again. The Empress is in black, a widow's attire that also asserts her piousness and retirement to a life in a convent in Vienna. August III and Maria Josepha had 15 children altogether. The first 3 were sons. My prince was the 3rd son. You see him indicated on the screen. He was followed by 3 sisters, so there was legitimate concern for the succession and for his health. Nevertheless, the princesses had their roles to play and made dynastic marriages of consequence to the leading Catholic courts of Europe. Maria Amalia to the King of Naples. Later, they were King and Queen of Spain. And Marie-Joseph married the Dauphin and was mother of the last 3 kings of France. You see Count Wackerbarth standing next to the prince in this painting. It's in the Louvre, actually, and it's a copy of the original by Silvestre, which was lost in World War II. For a long overshadowed prince who was evidently, all the members of the royal family were prolific letter writers, and much of this correspondence has been preserved. Here on the left is a letter from the Empress to her grandson, handwritten and in French, dated April 1738, and she acknowledges the news that he would be permitted to travel to Italy. His letter on the right, it was written from Naples, announcing his safe arrival in June. 2 years later, he would see her again in Vienna. There's lots of correspondence between the prince and his mother and grandmother, and the 2 women nagged him constantly. They wanted him to abandon his wig and let his natural hair grow. They admonished him for not eating fresh fish while he was in Venice because it was better than he would find at home. And they nagged him about the piousness of his devotions, as if he prayed more fervently, he might be cured. This was Catholic guilt in full swing. For a long overshadowed prince who was evidently a sickly child, we have portraits that show him to be normal, if not robust. In fact, he suffered from birth with muscular disorders akin to cerebral palsy. And by the time he left for Naples, he could not stand or dress himself, or walk or eat unassisted. In fact, the doctors in Naples reported his only useful limb was his right arm. Evidently, his right hand could write his diaries. It was said that his condition was the result of a shock to the fetus when his mother witnessed the tortured death of an animal during a hunt, and he was never expected to survive. The portraits demonstrate that there was no precedent for portraying disability, especially when the prince was an elected heir to the throne. So I think this is significant. It would have been a sign of weakness to present him otherwise, but also there was no model or example for portrait painters to show them in otherwise. This was the tradition of portraiture in the day. And of course, these are a beautiful range of portraits. The 3 of him aged quite young are owned by members of the Wackerbarth and von Klenke families, and the bottom 3 are in the Dresden collections today. In fact, there are only 2 paintings that portray him as disabled. One, a view of his arrival on Venetian soil in 1740, where he requires 2 men to hold him upright despite the cane in his left hand. And a depiction of him with his wife and family in exile in Munich in 1761 during the 7 Years' War shows him in a wheelchair of the sort made for him in France by his sister, the Dauphine. The prince was very happily married to the musical Bavarian princess Maria Antonia, and together they renovated the Taschenberg Palais in Dresden for their brood of 8 healthy children, which is another part of his life story yet to be told. The prince relied from childhood on being carried, usually in a porte-chaise or sedan chair, which was not for him the ceremonial or princely mode of transportation, but one he took out of necessity due to his inability to stand and walk. He was also presented with a small trap drawn by a pony so that he could ride around outside in the gardens. In his letters to his parents, which are really heartbreaking, his parents were routinely away in Poland because they were electors in Saxony, but kings in Poland. So it was required that they spend a lot of time there. They routinely left their children at home. Even when they went to Moritzburg, they often left the prince at home, somewhat to hide him, I would say. But he compensated for their absences by writing them letters. And at a certain point, he abandons the letters in order to write a journal mimicking Wackerbot, his major domo. But in these early letters, he describes holding onto the edge of a circular table and walking around it again and again and again in the hopes of strengthening his legs such that the prince, the king and the queen would bring him to Poland on one of their future journeys. The parents, or more correctly, Count Bruhl, the prime minister, wrote to the courts of Europe for medical advice. One reply from England, a portion of it is shown on the right, was written in the court language of French and promised a physical therapy machine which could be constructed if certain measurements of his legs were provided. And the physical therapist himself would travel to Dresden to treat the boy. This recommendation came from Sir Hans Sloane. In researching and driving the prince's itinerary, I used new maps and big Xeroxes of old maps to keep the historic post roads, to the historic post roads that he traveled. And you can see, I think here, for example, I would highlight things so that this was a map of historic post roads, and then I would make notations and copy the same routes on the road maps to make sure that and the post roads, as they do in America, remain today, but it is slow going, traveling on the slow roads, it must be said, the post roads, it must be said. This map here actually is bound into the archival documentation for his journey. So it was part of the planning and was conserved on the return to Dresden. I usually noted the date and time of my stops in various places. I particularly noted the weather and compared it to the weather that he experienced. I usually traveled actually during the times of years that he traveled. I attempted to do so, always starting in the spring or summer in Dresden. That didn't work on the return journeys, but nevertheless, it was a way to be able in future to compare my experience with his. After Dresden, the prince stopped in Prague to visit the tomb of St. John Nepomuk in St. Vitus and the Loreto in Prague, which is one of several Loretos inspired by the shrine in Italy. Nepomuk was the newly minted saint of the Habsburg state of Bohemia. He was canonized in 1729, and the prince brought relics of this saint with him to Italy and presented them to various churches along the way. The Marian pilgrimage route through Austria took us to St. Polten, where Empress Wilhelmine Amalia came from Venice specifically to meet her grandchildren, since their pilgrimage route bypassed Vienna. And again, I stress that this was highly unusual for family members, for a grandmother to meet her grandchildren in this way. And it was, I think, typical of this family that they were very close. They stopped, and I stopped as well, in Lilienfeld, Mariazell, and Annaberg to worship. They worshiped, well, maybe I said a prayer as well, and presented rosaries. They had rain, as I had encountered in 2010 and 2012, which made for rough driving on the winding roads, which I shared with lots of cyclists. Even in the Bentley, it was rough going. We passed through present-day Austria into Slovenia through unmanned checkpoints left over from the former communist times. On the left is the view of the once grand and abandoned Lantieri Palace where they stayed, which has now been restored and is the center for the promotion of the Slovenian wine industry. So it was really very exciting to do this drive twice. The first time was really exploratory, and so I sort of knew what to expect the second time. In the interim, this palace was abandoned with broken glass in 2010 and was revitalized and reopened as this wine center in 2012. So it was remarkable to see the progress. Opposite this facade are the remnants of an enormous garden, which doesn't exist anymore, just indications. So it must have been a very grand estate. If it weren't for the prince, I wouldn't have discovered the wonderful fortress city of Palmanova. And even on the navigation device you see here, it shows the star-shaped plan of this fortified city. That's the dashboard of the Bentley with a Breitling clock at the top. Remarkably, the screen was blank in Slovenia, so Slovenia didn't exist at that time on the navigation device. Of course, the Venetian Republic was awaiting the Queen's passage and were disappointed that she would not make an official visit. Nevertheless, in a carefully crafted space-saving effort, she was allowed to float through the La Serenissima by boat before resuming the overland journey to Ferrara. The traditional gifts from the Republic included a Murano glass table centerpiece and local foodstuffs like fish, fruits, vegetables, and wine. Pallets of foodstuffs were actually a leitmotif on the journey and delivered to the travelers at every stop in the guise of tributes and gifts, but of course they were actually essential for keeping the entourage fed. Remarkably, this is the glass centerpiece in the museum in Murano, and the prince and his sister were both said to be presented with one of these, and there's no evidence of them ever having made their way to Dresden or broken en route. So it's kind of a mystery what happened to them, and they are rarely known outside of Venice even today. I've been to Venice many times for research for the biennales and special occasions, and I happen to be a visiting scholar at the Cini Foundation on San Giorgio Maggiore when the prize-winning cars from the Louis Vuitton Monte Carlo to Serenissima race were deposited by ferry onto the piazza in front of the church. I mingled for a while with the organizers as they literally pushed the cars into place ahead of a day of celebrations, until someone noticed my Cini badge was not a Vuitton badge, and I had to step outside the velvet rope. Needless to say, the cars were a spectacle, and people were bobbing around in boats around the perimeter of the piazza to ogle them. Probably the Queen enjoyed the same reaction on her passage along the Grand Canal. The Bentley was likewise a celebrity with a cast of admirers. I was pulled over routinely to make sure the car with UK plates and so far from home wasn't stolen. Everyone was surprised to find a female American in the driver's seat, especially the men at the gas stations, who readily stepped up to pump the gas for me and helpfully suggested I could make better time if I moved from the post roads to the highways. At 2 points during the Bentley drive, photographers accustomed to shooting car stories met me, and each one asked, where was the driver and where was my assistant? Well, I was the driver and I was the assistant, and I even washed the car by hand the morning before they arrived, since I didn't trust a car wash not to scratch it, but I had to get the bugs off the windshield for the photo shoot. The photographers quickly realized that this was my first and actually my only automotive story. When I couldn't understand their directions or follow their cues, they wanted me to spin the tires and do various maneuvers, which I didn't understand at all. The shoots took hours, not simply because I was inept, but because they wanted to photograph the car in various locations, moving, stationary, and they kept an eye on the weather. And at one point there was a rainbow, which they knew meant, this photographer in particular knew meant that there'd be certain ideal light conditions. So we raced towards Loreto. You see it in the distance, so he could capture this shot. So it was really a fascinating experience to work with them. I also hasten to add I was not paid a penny for this story, but I was given $1,200 for gas. The way I made up for the rest was that I lobbied hotels along the way to give me a free room in return for parking the car out front for publicity purposes. In Loreto, I twice stayed in a humble pilgrim hotel right here on the side of the piazza. And therefore I had a view of the Volkswagen or the Bentley parked at night beneath the papal apartments in Loreto where the teenagers stayed the night. I went to the archive in Loreto and the nun showed me the logbook. You see a page of it here where the gift of a lapis lazuli rosary was noted. After Loreto came the cities and churches and palaces of Umbria. The Buoncorsi Palace in Macerata had been newly renovated at the time I visited, and the prince rightly called it in his diary the most beautiful palace he had seen on the journey so far. The Appian Way took them to Gaeta, where the queen met her husband for the first time at the gateway between the Papal States and the Kingdom of Naples. They were introduced in a palatial tent constructed to span the frontier, an event worthy of note on this plaque on one of the abandoned city gates. So it was really, again, wonderful. I would pull over looking for, and there was wartime damage in certain regions in Italy, but so much of Italy is intact, so I could really find precisely not just the routes, but the places he cites in the diaries. And it took me a while to figure out where they actually crossed, and then hopefully I found this plaque mounted on the side of this gateway. Porcelain from the Royal Porcelain Manufactory at Meissen was specially commissioned for the King of Naples and for his mother, Elizabeth Farnese, Queen of Spain, at a time when porcelain was a luxury item reserved for princes and kings, a sort of white gold and a collector's item too precious for daily use. Here you see an almost unique surviving beaker from a much more extensive service produced for the occasion. It has the alliance arms of the king and the queen. This slide shows parts of an elaborate toilet service sent to Maria Amalia by her parents in 1748 to celebrate the birth of her first son. So she had only daughters, and then finally a son was born, and that was cause for celebration because there was an heir to the throne. This service is now widely dispersed, and the shapes reflect the influence of high-style silver toilet services as were presented to royal brides. The Watteau subjects painted onto these pieces were done in a green monochrome, and that color was the privilege of the Saxon royal family. Notice that each piece had its own custom-fitted leather container to protect it during shipping, and each porcelain carried the alliance arms of the King and Queen of Naples. That accordion-type item here was actually to hold powder so you could powder a wig. That so much of the service survives demonstrates that it was a representational object and was cherished but never used. This is the prince's story, so we'll say goodbye to the queen and hello to Ischia, where the prince spent 2.5 months at the height of summer and turned 16 on what was then a barren island, except for the fledgling spa of Dr. Buonocore. Isolated from his sister or most of his staff, the boy fell into a depression. His isolation and despair, I think, is something we can connect with during these difficult times, especially during the initial days and weeks of lockdown. Finally, he was released to the mainland to recuperate at the palace in Portici with his sister. Yet the intensive baths and massage therapies had worked some magic, and he regained the use of his left hand. He was able to stand unassisted and walk short distances with 2 canes, and he did a bit of sightseeing, including ascending Vesuvius in a porte-chaise. But he rebelled against a second cure on Ischia, and his parents gave him permission to leave for Rome, just days ahead of the rediscovery of Herculaneum, actually, which would inspire the next generation of grand tourists to visit Naples. Neither the prince nor Count Wackerbarth mention Friedrich Christian's farewell to his sister, Maria Amalia, whom he would never see again. But a member of the prince's entourage wrote that he wept. I want to remind you of the stops along the prince's northward journey, which followed the Roman roads and post roads without significant detours. He stopped in Rome intending to spend a few weeks, but ended up staying a year, continuing his cure and enjoying all that Rome has to offer then as now. The legendary Cardinals Albani oversaw his daily program, which balanced sightseeing and outings with religious devotions and twice-a-day masses. And he had 2 audiences with the Pope. The church had a serious stake in helping to groom this Catholic heir to a throne in the Protestant north, and while the prince was abroad, a grand cathedral was being erected in Dresden adjoining the royal palace, and you see the cathedral depicted on the largest vessel of this service gifted to the Pope in 1743, so after our prince's departure, but relevant in the very studied nature of the iconography of this exceptional and pious diplomatic gift. The famous cardinals Alessandro and Annibale Albani ceded their palace at the Quattro Fontana to the prince, imagining he would stay for a few weeks instead of a year. They rented and furnished nearby lodgings, and many of the prince's entourage also occupied rented apartments, indicating Airbnb was alive and well in the 18th century. The Meissen busts of saints were commissioned, we believe, for the Cardinals Albani, and reference silver reliquary busts as are still seen in Italian churches and treasuries today. I was very happy to have grand enough lodgings, excellent views, wonderful company, and outstanding food at the American Academy in Rome, perched on the top of one of its 7 hills. The prince was in Rome for a year, so I had a year's worth of diary entries to research on the ground on various stays, with certain clear objectives in archives, churches, and museums, and also I made explorations on foot with the prince as my guide. You can imagine my delight when, on a visit to the Biblioteca Angelica, I stumbled across this unknown portrait of the boy staring down at me from the walls above the card catalogue, showing him, as always, in robust form. The identity of the sitter had been lost because the label carries his pseudonym, that is, his pastoral Arcadian name, as you see it in quotes on the screen, a play on his alias, Comte de Lusace. Lusatia is a region in Saxony. The prince was full of surprises, as when I was researching this handwritten guidebook to the Capitoline Museum, which was presented to the prince and represents the rooms of the then quite new museum. It only opened in 1734, and it represented the rooms more or less as they were then and even now. And again, I stumbled across the prince, this time in the form of a marble plaque recording his quasi-official welcome by the Roman Senate in December 1738. The prince was incognito, so it could not be a state reception. After Rome, the prince headed for Florence, Livorno, Pisa, Milan, and the Veneto, while his staff went ahead to Venice to sit quarantine, as required by the Venetian Republic for all but persons of rank, evidently. Quarantine, something we can relate to, meant 40 days, and it was regularly imposed on couriers and others traveling into the state of Venice. The prince's route followed the Via Cassia to the border of Tuscany, where he and I toured the amazing Villa Farnese with his famous Sala del Mappamondo, every map lover's dream room. And yes, that is my Volkswagen in the foreground. He stayed overnight at the Medici Post House on October 17, 1739, and it was reported by another lodger that he wouldn't share his food. I was delighted to be loitering around this abandoned site when the caretaker suddenly arrived to do his weekly inspection, and he let me roam the place in his company. I really, these journeys with the prince are full of unexpected experiences and wonderful surprises. We went from San Quirico to Pisa and Livorno, Siena and Florence. The prince ascended the Leaning Tower of Pisa, as it was actually called then at the time and in his diaries. In a porte-chaise, he was carried to the top. I ascended the tower on foot, and even with railings installed today, it is terrifying. Livorno was largely destroyed in the war, World War II, but it's vividly reported in the prince's diaries because it was a state-of-art port with amazing storage facilities. From Florence to Bologna meant clearing the Passo del Giorgio, where the carriages were stuck in floodwaters, forcing them to be disassembled and transported by mule-drawn carts and boats, while the prince was carried over the pass in a sling chair. The next stop was Bologna, where the prince was hosted by the professors of the Academy of Sciences. Here you see him seated, surrounded by the professors who are explaining something to him, and in the background are glimpses of the studios. This rendering is the sort that was made to record the visits of special visitors to the Academy, and it's part of the Academy's tradition. Exceptionally, in Verona, I could stay at the Due Torri, the traveler's hotel where the prince stayed in 1739, when it was essentially far humbler. And I visited the Museo Maffei, which the prince toured with Maffei himself as his guide. Thence to Venice, where the prince lodged in Ca' Foscari, while his staff lodged nearby. He was welcomed by 4 young men, his deputies, from the leading families of Venice, who would serve as companions and guides. The Republic remembered well the visits of the prince's father and grandfather on their respective grand tours, and saw great potential in the prince's visit. So they honored him with events rarely mounted for special visitors, such as the bullfight in his honor in February 1740, which the prince witnessed from underneath the large awning of the balcony on the left. This composition by Vivaldi, which we heard while you were in the waiting room, waiting for the lecture to begin, was composed and performed for the prince, and thanks to a modern performance by an historical orchestra, we could play it in the Grande Kur galleries in 2018. The sheet is part of a large music collection assembled by the prince abroad, much of it lost today. I'd like to mention the late Geoffrey Tate, great porcelain collector and music lover, who conducted at Fenice and San Carlo, and in Turin and Hamburg in Australia, and Brooklyn, and hosted me on so many occasions in the opera houses and at his homes. I would also mention Johannes Augustsson and Peter Kerber, who also helped open my ears to the music of Dresden and the Grand Tour. In Dresden, I've often stayed at the Cini Foundation on San Giorgio Maggiore, though I have fallbacks on the Dosso d'Oro. Poor Venice with floods and then COVID. I think many of us were in mourning for that city before COVID hit our shores, and then all of the unrest and turmoil. The prince arrived in Venice ahead of Christmas 1739, intending to witness Carnival, but bad weather and disease kept him in Venice for altogether 6 months. The Venetian Republic was thrilled to roll out the red carpet, and besides the bullfight, they mounted a regatta in his honor. I was privileged to witness the historical regatta in 2018. You see a photograph on the upper right from a vantage point in view of the prince's position in Ca' Foscari. In 1740, the floats were designed by Antonio Ioli, and the prince purchased several of the designs from his, according to his privy purse, and these sheets have survived in the Kupferstick cabinet in Dresden today and were included in the Grand Tour. You see one of them at the top of the screen. The ceremonial barges were fanciful, ephemeral confections honoring various families, while the races were conducted in gondola-type boats with men with oars, as you can see in the foreground. The ritual of twice daily masses and venerations of the saints meant I had to visit dozens of churches in Venice and all over Italy to examine their location relative to his lodgings, or to see if they survived and how they look if they correspond to his reports. Many were closed or abandoned. Some were repurposed as archives. By and large, however, the churches were open and were precisely as he saw them, except for the addition of pews. This map and guidebook were dedicated to the prince, as you see by the coat of arms. The sites on the sides of the map suggest the usual tourist destinations of the day. Interesting to me are the numerous vegetable gardens, particularly on the Giudecca. You see them down here, and again on the perimeter here. Here's the Arsenale, which he had a private tour, and that's a wonderful, wonderful part of his diaries. In return for the prince's hospitality, Meissen services were commissioned for his hosts and deputies and others of merit. Here are 3 more vases from the Mocenigo garniture. The porcelains were ordered in March, and the coat of arms was sent to Dresden to inform the painters at Meissen. So you see it was sent in the diplomatic correspondence. Whoever designed the painterly program and elaborate ornamental passages likely perceived this type of decoration to be suited to Venetian tastes. Production of these extensive customized gifts would take months, and they only arrived after the prince's departure in June. As you see by the styling of as you see in this photograph, the styling of the decoration of the gifts varied widely from simple coats of arms to painterly narratives, according to the rank or perceived preferences of the recipients. The finished pieces were carefully packed into wooden crates and shipped to Venice, where they were unpacked and staged in leather presentation boxes like you see on the screen. Display boxes of this sort were customary for silver services as well. As with the toilet service sent to Maria Amalia in 1748, many of the gifted porcelains to Italy survive, Italy and other courts actually, because they were perceived as works of art and tributes too precious for use. The prince's final stop was his mother's court capital, Vienna, for a visit with his grandmother, who also lived from the mid-1720s in the cloistered convent she founded on the edge of the Belvedere. The convent celebrated its 300th anniversary in 2017. The prince stayed elsewhere, but was a regular visitor to the convent. This floor plan gives an impression of the size of the institution, which was anchored by a chapel. The nuns lived on the left. Female students who were educated in the convent lived in the central portion, and the empress occupied the apartments on the right. Within her state apartments, which were lavishly decorated, if a bit more subdued than her imperial apartments, there were also public spaces where she could receive visitors and private rooms that were off limits to everyone except her staff. The private rooms included her state bedroom, which was here, and her library and various anterooms. So these in gray were her public rooms where she could receive visitors, and these were the private rooms in yellow. Previous gifts of Meissen porcelain were kept in the antechamber. Some of these, the rooms are indicated on the screen, and the prince was actually permitted to come into these rooms and to other spaces in the convent, usually off limits to men. In fact, the Mother Superior, when I told her about the diaries, I asked, I had to gain special permission for access to the convent, and the Mother Superior disputed the reports in the diaries that that the prince, would ever have been allowed in any part of the convent, and indeed he was allowed in rooms that were normally only open to women. Evidently, a Meissen gift for the Empress was fast-tracked, so it arrived in Dresden. So it would arrive in Vienna in time for presentation by the Prince on her naming day on July 10th, 1740. These gifts would have been unpacked and staged and presented by the prince in person, but in the name of the king. The celadon-colored toilet service on the top was repurposed from Japanese palace stock and customized by the addition of her coat of arms. She also received a porcelain altar garniture, parts of which are on the screen, and this she installed in the chapel indicated and was witnessed there by the prince, according to his diaries. The prince arrived home as he turned 18 and took pleasure in showing his presents to his parents. They had preceded him, as you saw by the shipping document from Rome. His gifts even included a dog named Bruno, but I haven't found a portrait of this animal as yet. As a sign of his maturity, the prince no longer had to schedule an appointment to see his parents and could arrive at their apartments unannounced. The prince kept his journal until his marriage in 1747, the famous and largely unstudied Doppelhochzeit, or double marriage between the Wittelsbach and Bettine families. The musical and artistic Maria Antonia was a perfect match. They had 8 children and modernized and extended the Taschenberg Palais to suit their tastes in growing family. It contained a reliquary chapel with most of the relics from Italy embedded in shallow cases on the walls. The room was lost in the bombing of Dresden in 1945. Here's a photo of the city as it looked when I first arrived for graduate research in the 1980s. Like many of you, I have seen this phoenix rise from the ashes, and the Taschenberg Palais has been restored and reopened as a Kempinski hotel. I was able to park my Bentley outside of that hotel in exchange for a room. Evidently, a Meissen gift, In closing, beyond thanking you for spending a portion of your weekend with me, I'd like to state the obvious. Life as we know it has changed, and it's uncertain when we will feel comfortable enough to travel far and wide for pleasure or work, to leave home and board a plane or train or ride the subway without PPE and hand sanitizer. A vaccine will be discovered, and what will travel feel like then? Will we rush to revisit our favorite places, or is wanderlust a thing of the past? I personally would like to drive the Prince's itinerary right once more, and I propose that you join me this time for all of it or some of it, whether in a Bentley, a Volkswagen, or a bus. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Maureen, for transporting us all and bringing us all back to that grand tour so many years ago. Thank you for that. Just before we move on to questions, I do want to thank you all very much for joining us, but for those of you that need to leave, to let you know that next week we will be having our 8th FPS living room lecture from the wonderful Susanna Lamboy, who is an art historian and curator and a fantastic specialist of Delftware. And Susanna will be speaking to us about an upcoming exhibition which has been postponed, which will be opening in the next couple of months. So we look forward to welcoming Susanna next week. But please do feel free to write your questions into the chat box, and we will be able to get to those in due course. If I may start, Maureen, I was really interested to see the portraits that you showed of the prince, but were there contemporary accounts of other people around his disability? Was there stigma from people, or were they not really doing that because he was royal, or did people comment on it very much?
Well, actually, rather remarkably, I would have expected other comments about his condition, and the only report I came across was in a series of lectures written by Lady Mary Wortley Montagu, who was in Venice for Carnival and overlapped with the Prince. And she was very friendly with Madame Mocenigo and others. And so she was also occasionally included in activities or gatherings where the Prince was. And she talks about him as being crippled. Those are the terms that she used. She talks about him as being rather simple-minded, innocent, controlled by members of his staff. So it does give, I mean, she's outspoken, obviously, but many people must have witnessed him and his disability and his conditions. That said, he was incredibly knowledgeable about music and was expressed his opinions rather freely about the quality of musical performances of dance. And he was also very educated in architecture. He had studied with Debott and Langelun in Dresden. And so he had actually education, knowledge, and opinions. But again, I haven't to date, in everything I've researched, read anything except for her comments about his condition.
That's fascinating, thank you. Sort of along a similar line, we have a question in from Bridget Garza-Griffin. Bridget says, thank you for the lecture, and thinking back to those portraits, do you think that he had any agency or authority over how his image was shown to the public? And how, you know, in the same sense of how common was the knowledge that he did have these disabilities. But Bridget says that it reminds her of a very similar recent admittance of disability done in more modern times with the US presidential portraits of Roosevelt having polio and being paralyzed, and how he presented himself to the public. Have you got any comments to make on that?
Well, obviously I think it's much more acceptable now, but I haven't looked into any modern era representations or considered it in those terms. Sometimes my research or interest goes in the direction of his incognito in Rome, where he was in company of the cognito pretender to the English throne, and they were much more visible. So I sometimes deal with this invisibility cloak that he seemed to have worn, which meant that he was present at occasions where the pretender and his sons were noted by the local press, and the prince was rather marginalized. So that's not related to your question of disability, but sometimes my research goes in the direction of unanswered questions like that. And in the process, sometimes I stumble across other sorts of information relevant to what you might be asking about.
Great, thank you. We've got a question from Shirley Moyler. Maureen, did I understand you to say that Japanese porcelain was painted in Meissen and then presented as a Meissen gift?
No, that was, I'm sorry for the confusion. That celadon colored toilet service, and again, I apologize, I forgot to put up this slide you asked me to show at the end, and I'm such a novice at this. But if I go back, I think Shirley's asking about this service here. This was Meissen porcelain made for the Japanese palace, and when the Japanese palace project was essentially abandoned, there were all sorts of products which were essentially royal property and therefore could legitimately be repurposed by the king as a diplomatic gift, particularly to a family member. And so some of these, which were very Asian in shapes and palette, were actually repurposed for gifts for the Empress of Austria, but also for people at other courts. And so it means that they would have been refired with this coat of arms here. So it's Japanese palace stock, but Meissen porcelain made for the Japanese palace.
Great, thank you. And actually, just while you're on that slide, if you maybe
say sorry.
That. No, not at all, don't worry. We've had another question come in from Esther Schmidt asking if you now know where the porcelain altarpieces are. Where are they at the moment, or where are they now?
Julie Emerson has done a lot of work on this. It's very complicated because there were copies of these pieces made. So some are in the treasury, in the Schatzkammer in Vienna today, but some of the pieces are not authentic to the period and seem to be copies or later creations. So she would be the authority on that.
Mm-hmm. Brilliant, thank you. We've had another question come in asking about, since his sister was married to Don Carlos, did he have any contact with the Spanish embassy staff in Rome? Just because his stay coincided with a diplomatic breakdown between the Pope and Philip V, and that's why the question's been asked.
I'm not sure I fully understand the question. Maybe I should read it.
We might be able to unmute the speaker, perhaps. Felix, is that possible, maybe?
Again, you have to remember, I don't know what I'm doing. But I just didn't fully understand the question.
We're going to try and unmute the speaker, and I can ask another one whilst we're waiting for that to happen, hopefully. We've had a question in from Tessa Murdoch asking if the prince actually played music, if they sang, I guess, perhaps with the disability, perhaps singing was an interest of theirs.
I mentioned Johannes Augustsson, who's recently published a paper about the music collection assembled by the prince, and he writes about the fact that he had a clavichord tuned, which implies that he played music, but he definitely sang, and he was very proud of his voice. And the members of the Habsburg, the Habsburg children and grandchildren were really encouraged to follow their interests and develop individual skills. So there were generic educational goals, but they were also allowed to be individual. Music was very much a part of their upbringing and experience. And it seems that the prince sang, assisted during Mass. He also appeared on the stage from a young age. So there's lots of music in their lives.
Fantastic, thank you. So unfortunately, our speaker, or person who asked the question about the Spanish connection, their mic does not work, but it was really just asking if there was any relationship between the prince and the Spanish who were in Rome at the same time of his stay.
Well, in principle, there was a lot of friction actually between the Spanish court and the prince and the members of his entourage. The Spanish ambassador to Venice, actually, though, was regularly with the prince, and he scored an enormous service of Meissen porcelain with overblown coats of arms. But there was lots of suspicion. There was an effort in Naples to suppress the German servants that came with the queen and replace them with Neapolitan or Spanish servants. So I wonder if that might have continued in Rome as well. Again, I think Pablo Gestal or a few others might be better suited to talk about that.
To speak on that connection, yes, of course. Another question from Susan Jacques. Can you please share who created the Golden Rose and what is a good source for information on these gifts in the 17th and 18th century?
Oh, well, I can't say that I am a source for information on that. I mean, for me, it's the fact that you do encounter them in treasuries, and I'm certain they are made in Italy. And I don't know if someone like Jennifer, oh, help me, silver specialist at the Warburg, Tessa would know. Anyway, I'm not a specialist.
Montague?
Jennifer Montague, yeah. I mean, she might be someone, or Alvar, of course, would probably have written on this already. So I'm sorry, I don't have more background. What is important is that these kinds of presentations, like the Rose d'Or, they had to be presented almost secretly to the prince because he was incognito, and there was all kinds of protocol and subterfuge in the way these things were presented. But essentially they were presented to him for the Queen, and he would carry the letter and the rose d'or to her and present them to her.
Brilliant. Lots of questions still coming in. Thank you very much, everyone. Another one from Oliva Riccelli asking, how long did the prince stay in Florence? And is there any documentation on whom he met there and where he went when he was in Florence?
He didn't stay long. I have a WordPress site, Comte de Lusace, and I've posted all the diaries, and they are transcribed and searchable. There's a little search window, so if you type in Firenze or Florence or a name, Medici, but essentially he spent less than a week. He did go and tour the Boboli Gardens. The Dowager Princess Palatine met him. She was on a cure, I think, when he arrived, but she came back and showed him the state jewels, her pearls, and took him to see other things, spent time with him, talked with him, and they were both allowed to sit in armchairs, which, you know, was very privileged. He didn't have to sit on a stool. So that visit is, he also visited scientists in Florence, and I'm forgetting off the top of my head where he resided. There was lots of strategy to how the prince was housed, because no one wanted to show favoritism or for his host to be able to claim some special connection. So normally the prince rented lodgings and meals were taken. He invited people to dine with him. He didn't accept invitations to dine out. And so anytime he stayed in somebody's palace or villa, the owner had to be absent. So we find in Florence some information about that. In Naples, for example, he could never attend the receptions that his sister attended because he was incognito and it would show favoritism. So Florence is probably a little window onto the restrictions and formalities and protocol of that kind of visit. I don't know if he toured the Opificio workshops. He did tour the mosaic workshops in Rome.
Yeah, thank you very much. Another question from Pamela Roditi. If one deducts the long stays in various cities, I know you mentioned, I think he was in Rome for about a year, how long in total did his journey take? And how did that compare to the 2 journeys that you've taken over the years?
Well, he literally was 2 years on the road. I should tally up all the days I've spent studying him. When I drove his itineraries, it was a few weeks at a time. It was impossible to carve out 2 years in order to follow his itinerary precisely. And then I did do these city stays, which allowed me, for example, to go to Frascati, where he had spent a weekend to get away from the heat in Rome. So sometimes those were side trips that I didn't undertake as part of the actual journey. What was the other part of her question? How long?
How long was the total of his actual stay whilst he went on Grand Tour?
Compared to mine. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and actually, you know, I never spent a solid year in Rome pursuing what he did. So whenever I had an objective, a research objective, generally I tried to group together the churches I needed to see. You know, it was very compressed, but also things fell into place. And I was also very much considering in Venice, for example, the canal system is sort of the same, but sort of different. And so I was often trying to figure out the route he took on water and if that affected his itineraries. And he loved being in gondolas. He found it freeing. But of course, that was the mode of transportation that he took. And so if he was going to from point A to point B, what might his route be? And I often tried to stick to that. In Rome, where Termini Station is now, of course, that was an enormous palace complex and garden that he visited at the time. So these bird's eye views that are allowed by the Noli map and other historic maps of the cities, even that historic map of Venice, allow me to map his outings, because sometimes I cannot literally follow them by foot or even boat today.
Thank you, fascinating. Couple more questions, but I think we will start to draw to a close, but I'm sure Maureen would be happy to answer anything further after we finish this evening. But just one last question from Carola Hutman, that you mentioned that the prince probably had cerebral palsy. Is that a sort of 20th, 21st century diagnosis of the condition, or would that condition have been known in those days and in a different kind of title, or where is that information coming from?
Actually, the British, well, some of the doctors, some of the medical reports reference palsy. Palsy was a term, but Geoffrey Tate's wonderful doctor in Naples, actually, I gave her the medical reports written by the 4 court doctors in Naples, written about the prince's condition, and she translated them for me and diagnosed him. So that's principally where that came from. And it wasn't a degenerative muscular disorder, it was really more of a spastic disorder. And I think this aspect of physical therapy, of rehabilitating the muscles and stretching them, because so often, you know, his limbs became tightened and his hands were clenched, and so they had to relax them with various therapies. So I think that's also consistent with a muscular disorder like cerebral palsy.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you for that detail. It's really helpful to know. Fantastic. Well, I think that we should probably end it there. We have a lovely comment which has just come in from let me just try and find Niels Espeland, who's just mentioned that as you probably do know, that both your journeys were actually made in Volkswagen as VW to go Bentley in 1998. Which I think is a lovely note to end on. But
I might add to that, just to say that I tried to get a free, I rented the Volkswagen with a grant from Wellesley College, but when I wanted another car, I wrote to every car company that might have a connection to the story. So I wrote to all the German car manufacturers and to all the Italian car manufacturers. And at the time, Bentley was made at the Volkswagen Phaeton plant factory in Dresden. So I wrote to Bentley as well, knowing that they were a Volkswagen, and they were the only people who responded or offered me a car.
Wonderful. I think there's a lesson in all of that for all of us as we embark on our own grand tours and our own research trips in the future once we can all start moving around again. But Maureen, thank you. That was a fantastic lecture. Thank you to all of those of you who joined us. We had over, I think, 270 people this evening, which is fantastic. We're back same time, same place next week for Susanna Lamboy. And the week after that, we have quite a busy schedule as well with our FPS AGM. So please do think about becoming a member. If you're not a member already, you can find out more information on our website, on Instagram, Twitter and Facebook. It's £40 for the year for UK membership and £50 for overseas. So we'd love to welcome you to our future events and to all the benefits that our membership also offers. But it just leaves me to say, once again, thank you all so much. It's so fantastic to see us all here celebrating the decorative arts and our histories. Have a safe weekend and a lovely evening, afternoon or morning. Thank you very much, and we'll see you next week.